Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. On behalf of the conference organizers, welcome to this panel discussion on Islamic sciences and the most influential scholars. My name is Zain-Al-Husain, and to make the most of our time together, I'll jump straight into the proceedings. Our panelists today embody the idea of Islamic scholarship. They are two of the most distinguished gentlemen I know, and it is my distinct honor to introduce them to you. Shaykh Jafar Ladak was a successful businessman before he embarked on the path of full-time community service as a religious leader. He has qualifications from the Hawza in the holy city of Karbala, as well as from Al-Mahdi Institute in Birmingham, and a master's in Islamic law from the Islamic College of London. He has published 4 books and several papers. He was the resident alim at the Haydari Islamic Center and Hujjat Stanmore in London. He is the incoming resident alim of Babul Ilm Center in Leeds, and many of our viewers would have benefited from his wisdom, and we will be very familiar with his online lectures, which are available on YouTube and which are excellent. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh Ladak.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Professor Sajjad Rezvi is Associate Professor of Islamic Intellectual History and Islamic Studies, as well as the Director of the Center of the Study of Islam at the University of Exeter. He is also an advisor to various government departments in Britain and Europe. With postgraduate degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and several publications to his name spanning Islamic philosophy, theology, and Quranic exegesis, he is one of the preeminent academics involved in the study of Islam in the Western world today. Professor Rezvi also runs a fascinating blog entitled Hikmat, and I encourage the viewers to engage with that blog. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Rezvi.
Alaikum salam, Zain, and good evening. Assalamu alaikum to everyone out there.
And good morning to you from where I am. If I may begin our discussions with you, Shaykh Ladak. The ghaiba, or occultation, both the lesser and the greater occultation of the 12th Shi'i Imam, Ajjalallahu Faraj, presented unique challenges for Islamic scholarship. Please could you share some of your thoughts with us on this?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. I think we need to qualify the question for our audience. May Allah bless them all and grant us the opportunity to learn from one another. What we want to be able to do in this discussion with yourself and Sayyid Sajjad, Professor Sajjad, is to be able to think about the growth of the Shi'i intellectual journey. And so the question that you pose about what are the challenges that were present in the early period after the ghaiba of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, what we want to be able to ask ourselves are, what were the challenges and how did those scholars navigate those challenges, allowed us to be able to form the type of madhab and religion that we have today? And then we begin to juxtapose those with the multiple challenges that each era brings along with it. So from my humble perspective, there were 2 main challenges that were at the time of the earliest period of ghaiba. The first is the need for the crystallization of a Shi'i corpus. And the second was producing an early Imami identity for the community. Now, often because of the way in which our majalis are structured, our audience don't really necessarily know the inter-religious and intercultural influences that were present during the initial stage of development of the Imami religion and literature. And so it's important to reference the canonization of Imami literature, which occurred mainly in the Buyyid period, which is some 300 to 400 years after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. And that helps us to understand that there are certain scholars who played an essential role in paving the way towards the crystallization of the Shi'i classical corpus. If we go back a century into the 2nd to 3rd century after Hijrah, we will appreciate that that the century was marked by a number of events. There were a number of civil wars, both intellectual as well as physical. There was the political fragmentation of the Turks. There was the rise of Sunni traditionalism. And so the 3rd century was a space for the Shia to actually organize their faith a little bit more systemically. And most of the classical Shia ahadith compilations were the result of the works that came out of that Buyid period, during which the Shi'i intellectual activities were encouraged by the dynasty. And so there are 2 main issues that come out of this first period, is that the classical traditionalist or biographical tasks were to collect the information at the time and to arrange it and to order it such that we can start to make some proto-akhbari schools from the area of Qum. And the second challenge was then a number of exegetal works that were attributed to the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam that started to reflect later developments. They started to take on a more distinct theological trend or a mystical trend, and how to navigate some of those traditions that were coming up. So this was the first challenge that existed within the period of Ghaiba. And the second was the need to have a formation of an Imami identity, which in some part was in contradistinction to the Mu'taziliya identity that was coming up. So many people will know that there is multiple traditions, households within Islam at that time. There is the Ash'ari school, there is the Mu'tazili school, there is the Imami school of thought. Now, one particular Mu'tazili scholar, Abu al-Qasim al-Ka'bi al-Balkhi, who died in 319 after Hijrah, he was one of the heads of the Mu'tazili school. He has a very famous quote where he says that it should be said about the Mu'taziliya that their sect, the chain goes back towards the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. And he makes this chain that goes back to Muhammad al-Hanafiya, the adopted son of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And so what this did was, it placed a pressure upon the Imami school of thought to be able to distinguish itself. If you have 2 schools of thought grappling with each other, claiming proximity to Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam, some of the nuances can become lost. And often people don't know which school of thought is going to be the one that is actually associated to Ahl al-Bayt alayhimus salam. So there was a need to formalize the Shi'i identity. This arguably fell into the hands of scholars like Shaykh al-Mufid, Sharif al-Murtada, Shaykh al-Tusi, and they began to formalize our madhab on discourses that were going to be rivaling that of the Mu'taziliya, on the matter of otherworldly intercession for sinners, or imamat as being rationally necessary, or the idea of the 12 imams are infallible and can perform extraordinary actions, or the illegitimacy of certain earlier caliphs. All of this was significant for espousing an imami communal identity. And when these 3 scholars seemed to be very much in proximity with each other, such as when Sharif Murtada conforms to a tradition passed down to him by Shaykh al-Mufid, and Shaykh al-Tusi doesn't dissent, this gave great weight to the early formalization of the Shi'i identity. So number 1, the crystallization of a Shi'i canon, and number 2, the crystallization of an early Shi'i identity. These were the 2 main challenges in the early period of Ghaiba, in my humble opinion.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. Professor Rezvi, following up from what Sheikh just mentioned, in that historical era, could you possibly identify 2 great thinkers who you think are of significant importance? I hazard a guess that your Twitter handle, I believe, is Mullah Sadr, and I hazard a guess that one of those will possibly be Mullah Sadr.
Yeah, there's no surprises there. And also because of the fact that I'm primarily interested in philosophy, I'm going to nominate 2 philosophers. I think the reason why I picked them, and I'll say who they are in a second, although you know who one of them is because what happens in the intermediate period, and especially in the Safavid period, so the 16th and 17th century in particular, is that you get a crystallization of attitude towards knowledge and to the tradition. What is the Imami, the Shi'i tradition, which to a large extent still remains the case today. Although, of course, there are ways in which they're being contested right now. So the crystallization of that tradition happens in that Safavid period. And what happens is that there is a certain reception of these early works, compilations of hadith and exegesis that Shaykh Jafar was talking about earlier in the 3rd and 4th century in particular, from about 300 to 400 Hijri, as well as a further refinement of what had become the dominant theological school, which of course is the school ushered in by Khwaja Nasiruddin Tusi and his student Allama al-Hilli around the year 1300. So of course, that's the key kind of landscape of what I'm talking about. The two figures are Mir Damad, Mir Muhammad Baqir Damad Astarabadi, who dies in 1631 and was a very prominent jurist, philosopher, theologian, exegete, occultist of his time. And by the end of his life, he became the Shaykh al-Islam of Isfahan, which was the most significant clerical position, religious authoritative position in the Safavid Empire. And of course, the second person is Mullah Sadr Shirazi, Sadruddin Muhammad ibn Ibrahim Qawami al-Shirazi, who dies a few years later, 1636, and of course, Mir Damad's students. Now, the reason why I picked them, as I said, is about the way in which they reflect and refine the tradition which came before. And the way in which they do that is through a pivotal concept which is known as tahqiq, or a critical reflection upon arguments that have come before. So tahqiq is the idea that one does not merely imitate previous arguments, this notion known as taqlid, but rather one rethinks, refines, modifies, extends, creates anew, critically evaluates the arguments for themselves and shows one's own skill as a scholar in doing this. So this is the idea of tahqiq, which of course did not originate with Mir Damad and Mullah Sadr, but in many ways in the Shia tradition, they're the two who exemplify them. They also, alongside this notion of tahqiq, they had a holistic idea of knowledge and what the pursuit of knowledge was. And of course, given the theme linking to the birth, of course, of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, the point here to mention is that they are two of the significant figures who start to incorporate various sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen into a wider philosophical and metaphysical vision of reality. So if you want to understand what the nature of reality is, the nature of exegesis, engaging with the Quran, understanding what the hadith of the Imams are, then one brings in some of the important sayings and reflections of Amir al-Mu'mineen into that media. So whether that is elements from the so-called Diwan, the poetry of Amir al-Mu'mineen, whether it's some of the famous sermons from Nahj al-Balagha and the short sayings from the Nahj al-Balagha, especially, for example, the first sermon of the Nahj in particular, and also some other famous statements and sayings which are attributed to. And one of the things also they do is that they really orient the tradition in a way which, as I said, links together philosophy, mysticism, the occult, the understanding of the Shia tradition, by focusing in on one very specific kind of technique for doing that, which is rather interesting, which one finds in Mir Damad as well as in Mullah Sadr. In Mullah Sadr, you find it in his commentary on the Quran, his exegesis on the Quran. And this is the idea that the huruf muqatta'a, the discrete letters found at the beginning of certain surahs of the Quran, constitute a code for understanding the nature of the Quran and also reality itself. So what they do is they come up with a formula which links together all these letters of these huruf muqatta'at, these discrete letters, and they come up with this very famous phrase, which is Suratu Aliyin Haqqun Numsikuhu, that the path of Ali is truth that we adhere to, that we cleave to, that we follow. And so there's a very extensively kind of embedded Shi'i attachment to walaya, which lies at the very core of this wider vision of what metaphysics is, the nature of reality, the concepts that we use to make sense of our world, and of course the language that we use to then convey and communicate that. And so for those reasons, I would pick those two. Of course, I could say a lot more about the specific doctrinal positions, but I would focus perhaps more on this wider method and key that they bring together between the two of them.
Thank you, Professor Rezvi. That was fascinating. Of course, the theosophy of both those scholars and the existentialism that they expounded is quite different from the Western existentialism, isn't that correct? Because their focus was God.
Yeah, so the term existentialism, I think, is somewhat misleading. It's rather this notion of existence or being as a foundational reality which unites everything, right? So it's a certain vision of the unity as well as the way in which things appear and manifest themselves to one another. So modern existentialism is primarily one in which the Nietzschean idea of the death of God is very much taken. It's about the struggle of the human condition. Whereas this focus on wujud, on being that one finds in Mullah Saad, of course, Mir Damad is a slightly different position, because for Mir Damad, it's only God which is purely existence, and everything else has a very kind of derivative sense of what existence is. It's more the case that everything stems from God, everything is about that connection from God, everything comes from God and is ever moving on the path towards God. And that is the path that we need to be consciously on. And that, of course, is precisely the path that is then manifest by the wali, by the imam, and he is the one who then takes us to our destination on that path.
Thank you, Professor Rezvi. Sheikh Ladak, would you mind letting us know two of the most significant scholars in the contemporary era that mean a significant amount to you?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I think we might want to precede this question by asking ourselves, what is it that the Hawza Ilmiya wants to contribute and achieve? And then we are able to see the vision of these contemporary minds in accordance with that goal. So if we were to say, for example, that the Hawza Ilmiya is primarily there to provide muballighin or resident ulama, then of course we would judge scholarship coming out of it in accordance with those aims. If, however, we were to state that the goal of the Hawza Ilmiya was to contribute to the human and global endeavors and the emerging trends that exist around the world, then again we need to readjust our understanding of what we mean by the most significant contemporary thinkers. That aside, it would also be difficult to just name two, because we then end up thinking about isolating these individuals, and rather they are actually part of a wider trend. So there are a number of mujaddideen and renewers that are either those who are present who have recently passed away. We could probably start with people like His Eminence Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Fadlullah. If we go into some contemporary scholars, we would mention, for example, Sayyid Kamal al-Haydari, Haydar Hubbullah, Ayatollah Ibrahim Jannati. But what I want to be able to do is kind of just divide two trends. So if we go to the traditional fiqhi trend, we can identify one personality, and then from my own area of interest, which would be Quranic studies, I would like to then identify a second individual who I feel has provided us with a great shift in approach. So in the traditional fiqhi model, the person I would highlight is a scholar who passed away very recently, Ayatollah Yusuf Sani'i. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless him for his work. Sheikh Sani'i is well known for institutionalizing a new method of ijtihad. And actually, as much as people come to think of his name being associated with very radical ideas, actually he is very much vested within a mainstream usuli framework. However, his role of evolving the thinking of the system of ijtihad was that it was rooted in the idea of moral rationalism and our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not being able to do any injustice to anything, any person, and as an outcome of that, how we then begin to understand some of the laws that are within that. Ayatollah Sani'i actually made a jump in evolving the scope of rulings, and he helped in the continuity of fiqh. And actually, as much as his ideas were very, very provocative, his ideas were within the scope that existed today. And the reason why I think that's important is that it shows that there's an expansion in the thinking that is existing within an existing framework. The second person I would recommend to our dear audience to be able to look into is a scholar, again, who passed away maybe a decade ago by the name of Ayatollah Muhammad Sadiqi Tahrani. May Allah bless him as well. Ayatollah Sadiqi Tahrani was an eminent student of Sayyid Tabatabai. So we know Allama Tabatabai was the author of the Tafsir al-Mizan, and with that methodology that was enshrined by Sayyid Tabatabai, the tafsir of the Quran by the Quran, Ayatollah Sadiqi Tahrani took that methodology and maybe evolved it even a step further and ended up writing a very large commentary called Tafsir al-Furqan. And the reason why I pick him is that we have a number of scholars who in the recent or in this last decade have taken Quranic studies forward a great deal. For example, we have Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Taqi al-Mudarrisi, we have Ayatollah Hadi Ma'rifat. But the reason why I choose Sadiqi Tahrani was his insistence on being Quraniyun, or being amongst those who will establish the grounding of all matters through the Quran, and everything has to then be judged through that lens. What I see as part of the evolution of the times in which we're living in is that this idea of having a Quranic lens and everything else is judged by that, becoming more and more prominent, becoming more and more validated as well. And I think that this is providing us with a great jump, a big leap in the methodology of our school of thought. And I feel that if our audience acquaint themselves with these sorts of scholars, they will become very appreciative of a new way of approaching the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Ahsant. Thank you very much, Sheikhna. Professor Rezvi and Sheikhna, we have just about 7 minutes left, so if we could keep the next few answers brief but still profound as you have been so far, that would be much appreciated. Professor Rezvi, keeping with the contemporary era, what do you think are really the key exigencies of our time, for instance, technology, in the development of religious scholarship?
Just a question of the scholarship, it's also what I would consider the, I guess the demands and the challenges that the Hawza in particular faces, and what, in a sense, do people want from it. There are two things, or rather three things, which I think are general challenges which are very problematic, and then the question is, how do we then deal with that? The first one, of course, is what nowadays is known as the Anthropocene, the idea that humans have fundamentally not just messed up their own lives, but have actually messed up the cosmos, the world in which we're living. And we hence are living in a climate emergency, and we have to deal with that sort of issue. We have to change the way in which we live and behave within society. That is a very immediate problem that we face. The second one is what is sometimes known as epistemicide, and the fact that different modes of understanding the world, inquiring into knowledge and the way in which we grasp the world and understand ourselves have been obliterated, have been flattened out, have been destroyed by what has become a dominant mode of doing that, which arises out of Western colonialist modernity. And so in a sense, we need to think about how it is that we can recover elements of our traditions, which are broadly gone, but also how it is that we can then bring our traditions into conversation with other traditions globally to, in a sense, push back against the dominance of, as I said, a Western colonialist modernity. And the third one, I guess, which is related to that, is one about ethical values, norms, and ideas about how we should live, which again are being constantly questioned and interrogated in the ways in which it's extremely important for the Hausa, for those who are scholars, then to have the right sort of training to deal with that and the other two challenges. That is clearly, I think, a big task, a big ask in many ways to do. But the one first step in that would be a recognition that these are challenges, that these are problems that need to be found solutions to, or at least attempts to relate to. And also, alongside that, a recognition that the traditional conception of the Hausa as something which produces fairly closeted scholars of legal traditions and legal comportment is just insufficient. We need to go far beyond that. It's not just about adding sciences to the mix, but rather really thinking about what the pursuit of knowledge is and how does knowledge inform the way in which we live our lives and the way in which we want to form our own selves and communicate that to others.
Thank you very much. We have 4 minutes left, so I'll pose this question to both of you, probably starting with Sheikh Ladak, if you don't mind. And if you could keep the answers to 2 minutes, that'd be excellent. And traditional scholarship is is currently viewed to be unidirectional, so flowing, for example, from the marjaya to the layperson one way. How do you see the current use of technology or other means changing that and having a more bidirectional relationship between the lay people and the marjaya or scholarship? Sheikh?
I think that model is already shifting on the ground. So, for example, there is some work being done by Dr. Ali Raza Bajani and others coming out of Oxford that looks at the other roles of, or those who might be sit between the grassroots and the Maraji, and finding that actually one of the most dominating forces is actually the resident ulama. Aside from that, I think we need to reconfigure the way in which we imagine this religion, and I completely concur with Professor Rezvi's comments about the Anthropocene and trying to realign our thinking. I think we are still in such a dogmatic, nationalist, maybe at best internationalist type of vision of our faith, and we're still in some ways even fighting the Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Sulh, Dar al-Kufr motif. So I think if we begin to think about the role of the Maraji, I would like to see that the Maraji are no longer clamored in one or two particular locations, but rather need to be based across the world and developing or being party to the development of more local schools of thought around the world. In regards to the technology side of it, I think we're obviously on the cusp of artificial intelligence. And I think when it comes to the outdated ways of interacting with our Maraji, such as through websites that take us a month to get responses and sometimes diverse responses, I think there is an urgent need to update our technology. And that should be based around artificial intelligence. So I think these are certain things that our audiences need to be considering now.
Thank you, Sheikh. Professor Rezvi, final thoughts, 1 minute?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I'd say two things. One is communication, how communication is articulated between communities and between the Maraja and centers of authority, and how that has to be much more collaborative and joined up. And secondly, an understanding that relationships are about mutual flourishing. They're not just about command and control, or rather mere sort of imitation and following, but rather, we're all together as Ahl Wilayat, as Ahl al-Walaya, to work together for certain common aims to help our flourishing and our path back to God, to the one with the Imam. And that's something which has to be recognized. Everyone has a role, expertise has a role, and has to be recognized as such.
Ahsant, Sheikh Ladak, Professor Rezvi, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your wisdom with us today. It has been a real pleasure spending this half hour with you. Thank you also to Sir Jawad Kazvini and all those working hard behind the scenes to make this conference a success. And thank you especially to the audience for your participation. I leave you with this final thought. In a tradition attributed to Imam Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam, the Imam says that one of the roles of the scholars or ulama is salvific, to protect the people. In reciprocity, please join me in praying for the well-being and health of all those scholars who are pursuing truth and knowledge around the world. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.